Welcome to Sit and Stay, the podcast that breaks down the challenges of starting and maintaining a mental health practice into digestible chapters. Sit and Stay is presented by RipsyTech, an electronic health record company committed to addressing the mental health crisis in the United States.
Welcome back to the Sit and Stay podcast, brought to you by RipsyTech. I am one of your hosts, Parker Anderson, RipsyTech Product Manager, and I am joined by the magnificent CEO and President of RipsyTech, Tom Tarshish.
I would say you are the host, Parker. You tend to sort of put together the content and ask the questions.
Well, this is a joint venture. We were co-hosts. I do all of the, I do the words, the titles, the thumbnails. If you ever look at a thumbnail and you go, I don't know about that one, send me an email. Because I'm the one doing it. Fair enough. All right, Tom.
Is it a partnership? Is it a co-venture? What is the structure?
Oh, I see what you're doing. I don't actually know. We haven't discussed this. There hasn't been a formal agreement of ownership, partial or lack thereof. I don't know. This is an interesting topic. Sounds like something people who start some kind of a venture together should discuss. And yes, that is something that we are going to discuss, particularly about mental health practices. Specifically, we got this question from one of our great listeners, Bilal Bari. He loves to submit questions, and he submits really good questions. So as long as we keep getting good questions from our listeners, we are going to keep talking about them. So he asked us this question about, he's starting a private practice, and how do you kind of weigh like who owns how much of the practice? And I'm thinking in terms of all shapes and sizes, right? Like you might have a group practice that has 60 providers, and maybe just one person owns the whole thing, or maybe everybody kind of has like their own small piece of it. Maybe you start a practice with you and somebody else. Is it 50-50? Well, what happens when new people come on? What if it's now 3 people? Is it the 2 people own it and this third person is kind of just an employee and they don't have any ownership? I'm sure there's got to be many different ways of going about this and many different ways that people have gone about it. So it's an interesting discussion. It's an interesting topic to discuss. Let's get into it. So, pros and cons of offering ownership versus keeping a provider as an employee or a contractor. I guess let's start there.
Yeah, and it's a very, very good topic. It's something important to think about. Sort of the first piece goes to how you set up your entity structure. And for mental health clinicians and especially physicians, each state does have rules around what type of corporate structure you can or cannot have. So, that is something that, and we talk about that in our private practice course, but that is something that you need to be aware of when you're thinking about these different ownership structures. So just throwing that out there. The second piece is that almost anything that you can think of can be implemented. And we'll talk about some of the more common ones. But, to the general question of, do you keep people as, employees or contractors, or do you offer ownership? Well, what do you think, Parker, if you are just an employee, or if you actually own a percent of company you work for, either through shares or through, a partnership arrangement? What is that? What are the benefits of that for the employee?
What are the benefits of the ownership to the employee?
Yeah.
I mean, if you have partial ownership, I mean, at its simplest level, if you have partial ownership and now suddenly this company is worth, billions of dollars, then that is of great benefit to you. That's an asset to you that exists outside of the money that's in your bank account. That would be my answer.
And it's always interesting where people go with the questions. I think it's there's research to support this also, but when people have an ownership stake and or get rewarded when a company does well, they tend to be happier and work a little harder.
Oh,
The work a little harder
good.
is the benefit for on the other side, maybe for the person who started the company, or and all this again depends on some of the structures we'll talk about. The one problem with what you said is if the company's worth billions of dollars, but there's nothing in place where the owners would ever sell, and there's nothing in place for you to actually sell your ownership percent, then it's not actually worth
Interesting.
anything.
Okay.
But from a psychological standpoint, as we're talking about mental health practices, people tend to feel better about coming to work when they have ownership, and when that ownership is structured with set rewards, either with yearly payouts depending on how the company's doing, set number of shares, or if the goal of the company is to actually sell in 5 or 10 years, and that depending on your ownership, you're going to get some revenue there, that can be very powerful for employees. And so what we can kind of leave it there. Then there's much more complicated places to go depending on partnership and ownership structures that we can talk about a little bit.
Okay, so what I've gathered from that is that if somebody is partial owner, but nobody's selling any part of the company, then it doesn't really mean a whole lot. But if you okay, this is interesting because I am full blown learning all of this right now. So if you're talking about a psychological benefit to feeling a sense of, it's like a sense of ownership over the company. You almost feel like a sense of maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's responsibility to see things do well because you do partially own this business. I don't know. That's really interesting. That is really interesting.
And with ownership, Parker, and we're missing a big piece, right? There's two pieces to ownership. One is potential financial compensation, or possibly some financial risk, which we can talk about in partnership models. But the other is control of the company.
Right.
So ownership can be set up so it's only with some financial rewards, or ownership can be set up with some like control in how the company does things. And when you give some of that control to employees as well, that gets people more invested in what's happening and makes people feel in general, people want the place they work for to do well. So you get a little of that, but if you're giving some decision-making power, that can also be helpful.
Okay. And that would be like before a company goes public or something, speaking purely in business terms, if a company goes public, then people could buy shares, which would then kind of get them a seat at the table, so to speak.
Well, and that depends also, right? In general, so for like a C corporation, which you can administer shares and then potentially go public one day, the company is essentially controlled by a board of directors who elects the CEO and other positions and determines the direction of the company. As a shareholder, you do get some say, but unless you've managed to buy a majority control of shares, you're unlikely to get a seat at the board of directors, or
right.
Depending on how things are set up. In mental health practices, because of the restrictions we talked about by a lot of states, it is less likely to have a C corporation structure,
Right.
with the exception of if you're a non-profit. Well, if you're a nonprofit in certain states, you can be a C corporation. You don't give out shares for nonprofits, so
Right.
I think that's potentially why they allow that. But
Okay, interesting.
so
So,
what people tend to do, and we can talk about that a little bit though, is you can set up systems that sort of have what are called phantom shares. So it's you people have these shares that exist for the company, but they're not anything that gives specific ownership or control, but it is tied to like a profit sharing program or some financial incentive. So it's a way to structure a bonus system that people who've been there longer can potentially earn more phantom shares and get a bigger share of whatever bonus structure is set up for the company.
gotcha. Okay, so some of it is just based on how the company has decided to set things up on their own, or create any bonus structure or program or whatever it is. Okay, so we're talking about how this is of a potential benefit to offer this. What about people who are just starting out and they have too much demand for services and they need to hire more people? Is this something that they should be thinking about right from the get-go, or is it something that can happen a little bit later?
Yeah, so great question. So I this is and it's another one of these topics where sometimes the lack of financial training for mental health professionals and physicians doesn't arm people with the skill set to ask about ownership and partnership. But if you have a colleague who's looking for a job and this is an outstanding clinician, you want to bring them in, but they're thinking of going to start their own private practice. Really, the most compelling thing then would be, hey, well, let's come be an owner. Let's and work here and let's build a clinic together. So thinking about partnership and what you're willing to do, and then being able to offer that to attract the best talent and keep them from going to set up a separate shop. That is why you want to be thoughtful about what the partnership or ownership can do, because some of the best clinicians going their own path, this is the only way that it's going to be appealing to actually come join your group.
Okay, so you talked about you kind of briefly mentioned this earlier. We were going to talk about common ways of offering ownership to a new employee. What would be some common ways?
Yeah, so given how a lot of mental health practices are set up, usually set up as limited liability corporations or professional corporations that work on a percent ownership type. Instead of having shares, it just goes to percent ownership of the company, right? So sole proprietor, you own 100% of your company. You can, and then you have full control. You take all the risk yourself. If you want to bring partners in, you can set up an arrangement where you can give away as much of the company as you want with the partnership. There are ways to structure it so it's a financial partnership only. However, a lot of people coming in will want some say in what's happening with the company and the business. So there's usually an ownership and financial piece. You could get someone coming in, say there's 3 people starting a practice. You could each come in with 33 and a third percent ownership, and with 3 vote, everyone gets 1 vote on decision making for the company. And that's a reasonable structure, and everyone puts in $10,000 to get the practice rolling and started. I think the thing to think about, if you've already started your clinic and you've been solo, you need to be very careful about giving up those ownership stakes. there are so many people who've entered into business ventures with people they thought were very good friends, people they could really trust, only to see it go very poorly. I'm not speaking from experience, wink, wink. But so, when you're going to bring anyone else into your company, you have to think worst case scenario, that what's going to happen if this beautiful 20-year friendship, you know, you get stabbed in the back, and what's going to happen to your business. And I hate to prep people to think about things that way, but that is the way that you have to think about this. And if your decision is like, well, if that happens, then I'm okay losing that company and I'll restart. Or, if that is not a risk you're willing to take, you can structure the company so you always have 51%, and or you can make it so decision making, require all you can split up the company however you want, but you could have a separate structure for the control, and just keep yourself always with a required vote on control, and or requiring a unanimous decision by the board of directors or the managing people of the company to like oust you or do anything to your shares. So there are lots of legal ways to set it up so you always maintain full control. And usually if you're bringing people in, especially in mental health, some people don't want to deal with as much of the running the company or making some of the other decisions, but people are definitely interested in sharing the profits. So setting up these different sort of, I'm bringing in, there's 10 clinicians, we're going to do 60% of the profits going to go to the 10 of us. We're going to keep 20% for company growth and 20% for our other non-clinician employees. There's all these different ways to set it up, profit sharing wise, but then on the back end, you can set it up to keep the control yourself.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, we're talking a little bit about just kind of synthesizing everything. Feeling some sense of ownership is motivating, and people tend to care more about what's going on with the business when they have some ownership. How do you balance that with, who has final decision-making authority at the end of the day? How do you kind of maintain that line of like, we're all working on this together, but like, I, so to speak, have full decision-making authority, or these 3 people or these 5 people. How do you make that clear? And are there any challenges that arise with that?
Yeah, good question. And the interesting thing is, when I was running the company with over 100 employees, no one tended to really ask these questions, right? So it's this interesting sort of dynamic that, if you're kind of happy and get your paycheck, often people don't think about some of these other things. But it is this situation where if for example, you're not very tech savvy and you want to grow a clinic, and having someone who understands technology and how to choose the right EHR, well, that's easier now because you just use Ripsy, but maybe that's a skill set you lack, but you have this good friend that you've trusted and are bringing in, and they're really good at that skill. And that's, looking at people, being reflective and humble, and knowing that having multiple decision makers in general is a good thing. And then being careful about which employees you want to offer, partnership, ownership, and that ownership including control. See where your deficits are, see if it's people that you feel you can work with. You want people who are, humble, kind, and good communicators, and willing to talk about solutions instead of sort of coming down with the iron fist, so to speak.
Right.
At the end of all that, though, I think this it can go the wrong way where, hey, I'm bringing in 6 people and we're all going to talk about things. You can sometimes get it's hard to make decisions and get the work done if you have too many decision makers. So
Right.
yeah, I don't know if it is more of a, who can you bring in with skill sets to complement ours that is humble and a good person to work with. And it doesn't mean that things could go awry, but having difficult conversations at the beginning with the people you want to give heavy stakes of control and revenue to, you've got to just have all those conversations up front. And so many, I've been talking to a couple new groups recently and telling them, look, have you guys talked about what happens when your company does this or that? And so many new companies are just focused on, getting started and making a profit, that they don't even think about what to do when things go well. And then that creates problems. For example, like if someone's partner was doing the finances for a company, and, is that really, do you really want someone who's involved with the ownership, their partner, to be controlling the finances versus paying an accountant to manage things? It's just some of these things to think about.
By partner, you mean like a life partner?
Correct.
Gotcha.
Correct. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. So I feel like we've kind of answered all of the questions that I had. I guess, like, what, I mean, you shared a lot of conventional wisdom. Looking back, what would be the number one lesson, I guess, that you would offer to the listener?
Yeah, I think it was, if you're going in at the start, if you're forming a new entity or have just formed it and you're bringing in partners or people you want to work with, I do feel like that's less risky, and that you can have very good conversations about shared vision, shared goals. You can share some of the financial risk that happens at the beginning. You can share the workload. It can be very, very helpful to have people with you at the beginning to support through difficult times. And just make sure you talk about, what do you want to do with this company? Are you going to keep it till the end and then pass it down to other employees who share the vision? Do you want to sell it at some point to an outside group? How does the company feel about, profit sharing or revenue sharing for, other sets of employees, and how you're going to structure it? The more complicated scenario is if you have a practice that's been rolling and you have someone that wants to come in and wants some of that ownership, then you've got to be a lot more thoughtful.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want to actually put yourself at risk of losing the company you started, or someone having a very different direction because you haven't worked with them personally yet? And so in very general terms, if you've been rolling with your practice for a while and things are going well, you need to be a lot more cautious with how you're setting up structure around ownership and what can happen with you. Not to mention, of course, we haven't really talked about, this is more like partners or other colleagues forming a practice together. I don't know if we've talked directly about taking in private equity or venture capital or just outside investors.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it on kind of like a separate episode, but we haven't really.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we probably don't have time to get into it right now. But I guess something that I feel like I'm hearing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, I feel like I'm hearing, especially when things are small and you bring, maybe, you start the practice by yourself, you bring somebody else on, or maybe you start 2 people and then you bring somebody else on, or 3 people, whatever. It feels like the ownership is really goes to the person or the people that are taking on the financial risk with the business. Would that be like a fair thing to say?
Yeah, that's very fair, right? So ownership is exciting and it's fun to be the owner of a company, but if that financial risk, the financial risk and the responsibilities for running the company aren't shared equally among the owners, then that's a problem.
Right.
And there are these situations, again, for mental health clinicians who start businesses, especially, where maybe they bring people in and they said, okay, yeah, you're become a 10% owner and get these financial rewards, but they have forgotten to give them some of the burden of the risk and the responsibilities. And you want to make sure that you're not just offering too much without getting something in return. It's got to be a shared venture.
Gotcha. Okay. This has been really good. I know, we are short on time, so I say we forego the mental health business moment this week, unless you had something that you really wanted to talk about. But we can go ahead and skip the mental health business moment this week, and perhaps we can keep talking about this. This has been a lot for me to digest. I told you right before the meeting, right before we started recording, I was pretty didn't get a ton of sleep last night, so I'm like, oh wow, yeah, okay, this is a big topic to talk about. I'm feeling very tired.
Yeah, no, I think as a part two, I feel this has been like a very general sort of overview, and maybe we could do a part two with like, here's 3 specific ownership structures, from phantom shares to employee bonuses to partnerships with shared control and responsibility, to corporate structures with more traditional share distributions.
That sounds...
And get a little more into the details.
I think that sounds great. Let's definitely do that. This has been interesting. All right, Tom, I am going to wrap things up for today. Thank you for listening to the Sit and Stay podcast. If you are listening on YouTube, Spotify, anything that has any kind of rating system or a subscription, whatever, subscribe, like, comment, do all the things, interact. We love that stuff. It helps out the show. And if you want to get in touch with us, email us at sitandstay@ripsytech.com. All right. Tom, I will talk to you later.
Thank you, Parker.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Sit and Stay podcast. Until we meet again, we invite you to sit and stay with the ideas and stories shared today. Dive deeper into how RipsyTech can support your practice by visiting us at RipsyTech.com.